And for me, I think one of the most powerful maybe assumptions or first principles about Islam is the concept of the fitrah. Okay? Now, and I want to try and make you understand what I mean, why this is the first principle for us and why this is a very key assumption for us in order for us to understand ourselves and reality. So, as you know, in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said that every child is born in a state of fitrah. Then his parents essentially facilitate a change. And that change is that they turn into something else, like a Christian or a Jew or a Median. Now, many of the ulama, they discuss the concept of the fitrah. And the fitrah, coming from the triliteral Arabic stem, fatara, you have words like fatrun and fatarahu. The fitrah is something that is created within us that contains a form of knowledge. You could call it primary knowledge, first principle knowledge, you could call it proto knowledge, whatever the case may be. There's something ingrained within you, okay? And what that is that you acknowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you want to praise Him. We have an affinity to praise and to acknowledge that He deserves worship. This is the fitrah. However, the fitrah gets clouded. As per the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, something happens because of parenting, because of society, the fitrah gets clouded. Now, from this point of view, the fitrah is like our first principle that allows us to understand ourselves, allows us to understand the world around us, and it allows us to understand the role of rational arguments and the role of reason when it comes to acquiring and acknowledging the truth. For example, here's a statement from Al-Ghazali, for example. He said, every human being has in his depths of his consciousness the fact that Allah is a reality and He's entitled to worship. And even a few centuries later, the 14th century theologian Ibn Taymiyyah said something very similar. Now, so if that's the first principle concerning the nature of the human being, that they have a fitrah within them that already contains knowledge that Allah exists and that He deserves worship, but it gets clouded because of education, parenting, and socialization, then when we are engaging with other people, we have to engage with them in accordance to our first principle. Because what we usually do, unfortunately, we engage with people based on their first principles. Fine, some first principles can be shared, of course, but when it comes to engagement of trying to articulate Islam, sometimes we think we have to answer all the questions, we have to go into every single philosophy. No, because they already know in some sense that Allah exists and that He deserves worship. Our job, therefore, is not to convince them in some kind of mathematical, abstract, philosophical way, but to use enough reason to a degree to help them awaken the truth within. You want to help uncloud the fitrah to awaken the truth within. That's why God's existence is not proven per se. God's existence is discovered. And there's a fundamental difference. Who the hell are we to think we could prove a transcendent being that you could have absolutely no analogy, no comparison, even you can't even think and fathom the essence of this being, and you think now you can prove in some kind of absolutist way? I mean, come on, man, turn down the arrogant snob a little bit. The only reason you can even acknowledge His existence because He put it in you in the first place, right? And it's within us, in the fitrah, and our job is to uncloud the fitrah to awaken the truth within. This means, therefore, that rational arguments are a means. They are not the ends. They are a means to awaken the truth within. They're not the ends in themselves. Because there's no such thing as, Iman doesn't come into a human being from a mathematical argument. Iman doesn't come into a human being from some kind of logical, mathematical algorithm. Al-Ghazali, he mentioned this so clearly. He said Iman is not going to come from a deductive argument. If someone who's smarter than you, they would just play around with the premises. And what are you going to do then? Leave? Right? He said Iman is as a result of experiencing the Islamic tradition. Becoming the Islamic tradition from the point of view that you practice and your heart is in tune and in line with the spiritual practice and the values of Islam. So I like to basically use this diagram. Yeah. So look at this slide. This is the Fitrah. Within the Fitrah contains knowledge, as we said, that Allah is a reality and that He deserves praise. However, the Fitrah gets clouded. You see these clouds? You see these clouds, right? What are these? They're clouds, right? And this is echoing the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. It gets clouded because of parenting and education and society and whatever the case may be. The question here now is, what unclouds the Fitrah? It can be rational arguments. It could be just revelation. It could be spiritual experiences, positive or negative. It could be tadabbur and tafakkur. It could be pondering and reflection. There are different ways to awaken the truth within. It's not only one way. And we see this from reality and from the Sunnah itself, right? People will become Muslims just by looking at the face of the Prophet ﷺ. That was enough to awaken the truth within. This is on the face of Allah, right? Others required some direct revelation, like Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, when he was listening to the Quran, Surah Taha, right? Shabul, that awoken the truth within him, right? Others, they needed kind of an experiential, rational argument. Right? Like the famous Jew who pulled the neck of the Prophet ﷺ, pulled him by the neck because he owed him some money. And he wanted to test the Prophet ﷺ to see if he had hilm, if he had forbearance, patience against aggression. That was a logical argument for him. Because he said, well, the signs of prophethood are 3. I've seen 2, I need to see one more, which was forbearance, patience against aggression. Do you see my point? Everyone's fitrah is awoken in different ways. And that's why sometimes, especially in the West, we focus just on rational arguments, and we think it's only rational arguments, and we think they become an end in themselves. No, they are just means to awaken the truth within, because it's already within them. Now, this should fundamentally change the way we see rational arguments. It should allow you to become more intellectually and spiritually mature. I repeat, it should allow you to become more intellectually and spiritually mature. Because if you give someone a good enough argument that is enough to awaken the fitrah, and they still don't accept, then you should stop using rational arguments. That should be a sign for you that they need something else. That should be a sign for you that they need something else. And that's why we need to have more intellectual and spiritual maturity, so we get to understand that. Okay? For example, you could give someone a really good argument, the argument from design. Okay? And then usually a response from the atheist, or some atheists, is, oh, but there could still be a chance that there is no divine. Even in that ridiculous response, there's no point addressing that point anymore. There's no point addressing that question. Because for me, that is a sign that they need something else. Because think about the inconsistency in the rational approach. For everything in life, university, marriage, banking, finance, buying a house, buying a car, buying a mobile phone, going to the shops, crossing the road. For everything in life, their level of rationality is here. But for God, and only God, it's up here. Why the inconsistency? This exposes a psychosocial issue. But we are so stupid sometimes, and we get so kind of fixated with rational arguments. We think, no, I have to answer all the questions, right? Come on, just shut it for one moment. You can't even prove your own existence, and now you want 100% proof for other things. These are just ways that to awaken the fitrah. I remember someone in Ireland, I think it was Dublin or Cork University, was giving a talk. He said to me, Hamza, I want absolute proof for God's existence. And I said, well, before I answer that, essentially I was saying, prove to me you exist in an absolute way. And he looked at me, really funny. I said, how do you know you're just not on Mars? And this is the sort of big illusion in your brain. And I wanted to show to him, just calm down one moment, yeah? Rational arguments are just a way to awaken the truth within. And when you understand this properly, you know when you should stop in your useless and insincere arguments and debates. The Prophet ﷺ said that he guarantees a house in paradise for those who give up insincere, useless arguments and debates. Even if they're right. That's fine. Even if they're right. Okay? Even if they're right. And there is truth in that. Because when it comes to engaging with human beings, you being right is almost irrelevant. It's about using the correct way to awaken the truth within someone. And it could be by admitting you're wrong. It could be that through your humility, it could be a means to uncloud the fitrah. You just don't know. And this is why when I engage with atheists and I give them a good argument to a certain degree, if they go so nitty-gritty details about philosophy and they start discussing with me about, oh, but I'm an externalist when it comes to language, you're an internalist when it comes to language, therefore that gives you some kind of philosophical incompatibility in addressing the philosophy of the mind, which therefore means this, that, and the other, and he goes into crazy. I'm like, girl, just buy him a pizza now. But it's true. You think they're going to show that card on the Day of Judgment to Allah, right? Oh, sorry Allah, I was an internalist, for example. No, not that that has anything to do with God's existence, but I'm just giving an example. For example, this was a true story. I think I was at Southampton University in the UK, and someone came up to me and he said, oh, I'm Pakistani, but I'm an atheist, and, I don't believe in God kind of thing because outside of the universe there's no causality, which is not true, but that's what he said. There's no causality, therefore you can't claim there is a cause for the universe. And I was like, I know the answer to that question. I actually know the answer to that question, but I was like, okay, what do you mean by cause? Well, and I said, which of the differing interpretations of that word are you going to be using in a philosophical sense? He didn't answer the question. I said, isn't it interesting that you don't really know the meaning of the word that you used, that you've put in a sentence to formulate an argument against God's existence? What does that say about your psychosocial state? It's got nothing to do with the argument. And that's why this idea gives you emotional and intellectual spiritual maturity that you don't have to respond. I could have responded, I could have answered the question, but I sensed that he needed something else. So I chilled out with him, I sat down, and he was talking to me about his parents. And about, I never really connected with Allah before in terms of salah, I wasn't really praying. That was his problem. Not some kind of argument about cause and effect that he has no idea about. Do you see my point? Are you getting this point now? It's to make us more spiritually, intellectually mature, because we know what our first principle is, which we believe to be true, that makes sense of ourselves and of reality. And that's why I get really, really confused when I see videos or people arguing over the most minutiae points. I'm like, do you think that really is a barrier to someone's iman at this stage? You've given them enough. Change strategy. maybe they need spiritual experiences. Even me, right? When I became Muslim 16 years ago, yes, there was some rational stuff, but that wasn't enough. The rational stuff was not enough to awaken the truth within. What was enough is I went on Thursday to the markas with the Tablighi brothers as a non-Muslim, and I sat with hundreds of Tablighi brothers, and I had my head on the ground, and I learned how to pray, and I was asking Allah for guidance. That's what worked. Do you see my point? Not just some abstract, rational argument. A bakwas, as they say. Yeah, it's a lot of rubbish. But this is why we need to reclaim this intellectual, spiritual maturity back into our lives. And the reason we haven't, because we have an inferiority complex. Why? Because, we have a post-colonial crisis going on. We still have to, solve that big trauma that we've experienced as a collective community for the past 100 years. But come on, we need to not despair. Allah is with us. La tahzan, right? Inna Allah ma'ana. Allah is with us. So don't worry. And it's also because we haven't even understood the Western tradition properly. Don't get me wrong, there are overlaps as well. But the point is we see things from a very shallow point of view. We haven't even really understood this idea of first principles even. And it exists in every sphere of knowledge. So let me try and give you another example from my experiences concerning first principles and fitrah. I remember I was in Norway, I was speaking to a university student. And for him, I don't think reason and rationality was the issue. He needed something else. So I noticed that in him. So I could have went off on one saying, here's a really good argument for God, here's a really good argument for prophethood in a very abstract, logical way. But it wouldn't do anything for him. So what I did is I started talking about freedom. I was like, you want to be free, right? I said, you didn't even choose your own gender. How are you free? You didn't even choose your own birth. You didn't choose your name. You didn't choose your DNA. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your siblings. You didn't choose the socio-economic circumstances in which you were brought up. You didn't choose your first teacher. And you think you're absolutely free? Are you crazy? It reminds me of this philosopher said, man was born free, then he remains in shackles or something, yeah? Like, you're shackled to everything. You're shackled to your own sense of self, you're shackled to your ego, you're shackled to your parenting, your limited experiences, your limited ideas, you're shackled to everything. But what frees you is when you break those shackles and you enslave yourself to the one who created you, because he knows you better than you know yourself. And that's true freedom, I said. And Allah says in the Quran that consider the situation of two people. One man is a slave to many masters and they're all quarreling. And another man is a slave to one master. Whose condition's best? To become a free slave, right? Because if you don't worship your one true master Allah, you become a slave to so many different slave masters. As Iqbal, the poet, said, this one sajda you find so difficult frees you from 1,000 sajdas, right? Hi. Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah, right? But you get my point. And then he came the next day in the conference and he said to me, Hamza, I want to be free. Ashhadu, and then he continued and he became Muslim, right? So he needed something fundamentally different. He needed something that would change his state of being, right? Not just a state of abstract knowing. So this is just another example. There are different ways to awaken the truth within. This doesn't mean we don't have good arguments. No, we have good arguments. But the rest of the next few days, today and tomorrow, will only make sense if you understand that all spheres of knowledge have first principles that can't be proven, but they are required in order for that sphere of knowledge to grow, and that we have our own first principle concerning the self, that we have a fitrah, with knowledge within the fitrah that Allah is in reality, He deserves praise, but it gets clouded, and our job is to uncloud the fitrah, and the way to do that is not only using rational arguments, and if we do use rational arguments, there is a level and a limit, and rational arguments become means and not ends. Any questions until we move on to the next section? Yes, sir. Yes, of course. Okay, good question. So the brother is saying, can first principles be wrong? Maybe. And he said, well, if that's the case, how do we know our first principle is not wrong? Well, judging first principles in terms of truth value is not the best way forward, because in order to have truth, you still need to have first principles. Right? That's the irony. So the idea of saying, oh, is this first principle true, using that type of language is unhelpful, because you need a first principle to have any truth. So it's indispensable, bro. Right? It's indispensable. Therefore, what I would say is, instead of using the word truth in that sense, I would say, which first principle best explains ourselves and reality? Which first principle is more coherent? That's the point. And I would argue the fitrah is the first principle that makes sense of reality. So saying, oh, we have to prove our first principles is neither here or there, because you need first principles to have proof in the first place. So in a way, that question doesn't even apply to a certain degree. But yes, are some first principles better than others? Absolutely. Like if you compare the first principle of the fitrah with, for example, philosophical naturalism, which believes there is no divine, no supernatural, everything can be explained by physical processes. Well, if that's the case, which one best explains reality? I would say, well, the fitrah does, because we accept that things do have physical processes, but we also accept other fundamental truths about the human being, that some things can't be reduced to physical stuff, can't be explained to physical processes alone. So you can compare first principles too, absolutely. Yes, sir.
So the way to the fitrah, do you sometimes do more than one way?
Allahu Akbar. How old are you? Oh, may Allah bless you. So, don't say again.
To awaken the fitrah, do you need sometimes more than one way?
Absolutely. You're right. You could combine all three, all four, all five. Where's your father? Kiss his forehead for me. MashaAllah, you've done a good job. May Allah bless you. Have mercy on your family. So, our young brother is saying, can you use more than one way to awaken the fitrah? Absolutely. And this is why the importance of akhlaq and adab and being a good human being and having good interactions with people is very important, because that alone can also help awaken the fitrah. Now, if you combine it with a good rational argument and you combine it with creating awakenings with people so they can have positive experiences and understand their experiences in life in a profound way, if you could do that all together, then you've got a recipe for something very powerful here. This is why someone could say the same thing. It could be two people saying exactly the same thing, but we get guided from one person and not another person. It's because the way they said it, and the interaction, and what was in the heart, and the sincerity, and the ikhlas, and the humility, right? So you're right. It could be more than one way. Like for me, when I became Muslim, I needed a bit of rational arguments, I needed a bit of reflection, introspection, and a bit of experience. For example, for me, the rational arguments was contingency, the argument from contingency for God's existence. So I had that. Then it was the inimitability of the Quran, the ijaz of the Quran. Okay, I had that. But it wasn't enough. So then what I started reflecting on death, which helped me internalize some of the rational arguments that there's something important about them because they have life and death implications. But that still wasn't enough. Then I started learning how to pray and do wudu. And in sajda, I remember my friend told me that when you're in sajda, you're closer to your God, to your Lord, so speak to Him. So when I did that, then shabon, the recipe was there, right? So I needed at least 3 of them. Some people just need 1, some people need 5. Some people, unfortunately, are so, so arrogant that nothing would work. And this leads to the point about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah says no one can guide except Him, and no one can misguide except Him, right? And His guidance is not based on a mathematical formula. 1 + 1 is 2. It's based on an infinite wisdom. And this whole idea of the fitrah makes sense of that. Because if it was just based on a mathematical formula, we would have found it out by now. But it's not true, it's not the case. Any other questions? I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, this is so important because it becomes the lenses in which you need to put on your eyes in order to understand yourself, other people, the dawah, this course, the rational arguments that we're going to learn, because they are all context. They're all based upon what we've just mentioned today about the first principle. Yes?
I have a friend, actually a co-worker. He came from a Hindu background, and he's in the state between Hinduism and Islam. He believes in Allah, he believes in God, but he still believes some of the Hinduism tradition,
Okay.
and gods and all this. And sometimes when I talk to him, I think tomorrow he'll become a Muslim, and a week later he comes with all these crazy arguments, like for example, if God creates everything good, why did He create diseases and all this kind of stuff? So, what's your advice? How do I approach him in a way that effective and kind of polite? Because I don't want
I don't know.
his
I don't know for now. I don't know. Wait until the end of tomorrow. Alright? Because I don't know the person. And what you've told me is not enough for me to tell you how to engage with them. So hopefully you'll be able to answer that question yourself by the end of tomorrow. I could give you a fake answer if you want one. But it won't be rude because I don't know who I'm talking to. That's why it's very important when you're talking to people, you treat them as the individual, not as someone, not as an entity that you've judged. Because sometimes, when you've said he's not really Hindu, but he believes in Islam and he's my co-worker. Now, based on my limited experiences, I'm going to make a judgment on him already. So what I'm going to do is give dawah to the judgment, not give dawah to the person. But the only way to give dawah to the person, excuse me, is to get to know them and is to listen with the intention to understand. Yeah? So whatever I say won't be enough. Hopefully we'll give you the right tools in the next few days for you to basically answer that yourself, inshallah. Yeah? Yes?
Everything has first principle, so this means that everything is relative.
No, it doesn't.
Why?
Well, you tell me why. You made the statement, not me.
The first principle.
I can't prove your statement for you. You tell me.
The first principle, it might be right or wrong, or like true or false, right? That's what you mentioned.
No, I didn't say that. I said everything requires first principle.
It's like an assumption, right?
Yeah, it's like an assumption. Yeah. It's a necessary assumption.
The assumption, it might be proven right or wrong.
No, because things to be right or wrong require first principles. That's the point.
So it's basically, we'll return to the same thing, and then the rational argument will be irrelevant as well.
No, why would it be relative?
Because it's going to be based on an assumption, and this assumption...
No, but all arguments are based on assumptions. And then? I don't know, you tell me. Okay, so you're saying things that have first principles mean that everything is relative.
Yeah.
That doesn't follow. How does that follow? I want to know why that, for you, in your mind, that follows. Why is it the case that if something has a first principle and assumption, it means it's relative? How does it follow?
Because if it's an assumption, you need to prove it. If it's right or wrong, or like to reach the conclusion.
So, but how does that make it relative?
Because it might be right or wrong. Like you have to reach to a specific result, right?
Okay. But I don't see how that's going to be relative.
For example, you mentioned the behaviorist methods.
Yes.
Right? Some people will agree with it, Others will have like a different method.
Yes. That doesn't necessarily make it relative, though. I see what you're saying. People will only accept its truth if they accept my assumption. Agreed. That statement I agree with. But to say now it becomes relative, no. Because it could be coherent within its own assumption, and it could be the only possible conclusion based upon that assumption. For it to be relative is that there could be multiple conclusions based on the same assumption. There's a subtle difference, yeah? So you can have first principles and assumptions that their conclusions or the truth that arises from them is only one. That doesn't make it relative. It's relative in the sense that it's based on an assumption, but it's not relative in the sense that you can have more than one truth based on that assumption. That's the point. Okay? Yes, sir.
Is it right to say that if the fitrah gets unclouded, that's still not enough for somebody to become Muslim, because he can say, oh yeah, God is this, and I need to be a good person, I'm not harming anybody, I'm honest, I don't have a life, whatever. But like, how do you go from fitrah being unclouded and then becoming Muslim?
Oh, I don't know, that's from Allah. But the point here is, if a fitrah becomes unclouded, then that person will eventually become Muslim and know the truth. Because that's the whole point of the fitrah, isn't it? So, once it's unclouded, what happens? This is beyond me and you anyway. This is Allah's job. Our job is to help uncloud. What happens after that is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's no rational algorithm to show that. I can't give you a formula. Yeah.
So back to the question of assumptions. So if you assume something that leads to contradictions, then that's a bad assumption. And if it, because you said it shouldn't lead to more than one truth, right? Is that what you meant?
No, I said if something will be relative, if based on the same assumption, you can have more than one truth arising from it, or more than one conclusion.
By relative. Okay, so like, so her question just made me question like, because if you start questioning like basic assumptions, like that's like an unsettling thing to do, So like my question is like, how do you know what are good assumptions versus bad assumptions? Like for me, normally like you just look for contradictions. If there's a contradiction, like that's a bad assumption. Or like, so like, how do you know what's a safe assumption and what's not?
Well, the way to know what a good assumption is, or first principle is, because remember, we're not using assumption in the normal sense of the word, We're using assumption from the point of view that it cannot be reduced any further, that you require in order for that sphere of knowledge to progress, So we have to be clear in how we're using that term. So that type of first principle it would make sense if it's coherent, if it makes sense of yourself and reality.
So your definition is like coherence will determine the value of that assumption.
Yes, for me, like if someone's got an assumption about, for example, the individual in political theory, and their assumption is that the individual has primacy, meaning only the individual rights are the most important and social rights are not, then they've made an assumption. They've made an assumption there is no link between the individual and society and the individual. That I would say is incoherent because reality tells us something totally different. Do you see my point? Yeah. And that's why sometimes for some people, if to a certain degree they acknowledge Islam, for me, I just get them to start practicing, even if they don't do the Shahada. Honestly, they start practicing. I think Salah itself has a way of awakening the truth within. Some people disagree. They say, well, they get no reward for it. Yeah, but I don't see Salah that way. Salah, yes, obviously has 50 ramifications, but there's something intrinsically powerful about the sajda. That's why at the time of Prophet some Arabs will not even do sajda. They'll get dust and they'll put it on their forehead, because they still had the arrogance issue going on. So there's something intrinsic about the spiritual practice itself. So it happened in Canada. There was this guy who came to the masjid, I think when I was here a few years ago, and he was talking to me. I said, look, join us for salah. He joined us for Dawah prayer, and I told him, you're closest to your Lord, if I remember correctly, you're closest to your Lord in sajda, so talk to your Lord. After Dawah, he became Muslim. Yeah? So it happens, guys. So even salah and spiritual practice could be a form of an experience that helps awaken the truth within. Has everyone understood this point so far? But have you understood it from the perspective of now you know the limits to reason, you know the role of reason, that it is a means to awaken the truth within, and when you give people adequate evidence from what you consider to be adequate from a rational point of view, and then they have nitty-gritty philosophical questions, you don't need to answer them per se. Because that becomes an indication of something else that's going on. It means that rationality is not going to be the thing that enclouds their fitrah. It will probably be something else. And that's why we have to become intellectually and spiritually mature to deal with these issues. And that's why sometimes when I deal with atheists, look, I'm going to be honest with you, I've done this for so long, I've gone back into academia, and I know how to be a very, very good atheist. Honestly. I feel sorry for the atheists. I could be much better atheist than them. I did it in Pakistan once, right? When I had to give a talk at Lums. And they didn't let me give a talk there, so we had to find another venue. And some of the students came, and they were a bit atheistic orientated, right? And one guy quoted Richard Dawkins' book. And I was like, you don't understand what Richard Dawkins said. Let me tell you what he really meant. Sit down. And I'll tell you what he meant. And then he stood up and I said, no, let me tell you the implications of it, and let me tell you the refutations. Listen, I'm a better atheist than you. Right? So the reason I'm saying this is because reason has a certain level, has a certain limit. And when you use enough rational arguments, and it still hasn't worked, then going beyond that is going to be irrelevant. You just need to shift your strategy. Other things may be able to awaken the truth within. Right? So, yes, sir.
So our first principle is that the Fitrah exists.
Well, there's more than one first principle in Islam, obviously, but this is one of them in our context. Yeah.
Okay, so how do we prove to somebody in a discussion that Fitrah, what we've taken as a first principle, is a good enough first principle?
You don't have to, because this is not an argument for you to use. If anyone, I hope it was clear enough to make people realize this is not an argument that you use with an atheist. This was a session to make you understand your own self, the human being, and how you could approach them in light of our Islamic principles and values and theology. You're not going to prove this to anybody, right? You don't have to. But now we've set the right framework or the right ground in order for us to walk on, so we could start now using these arguments in an effective way.